Okay, I'll try and keep this to time. There's a lot to talk about because it was a radical decade. Equally, I could talk about the 90s, which for us were even more radical, I think. But there we go. We're just talking about the 90s. And I've got a lot of images to rattle through. Those eagle-eyed amongst you might spot that one of those posters is from 1990. Is that allowed? So, new sculpture. I just needed one that fitted that shape, and I couldn't find one. But you can just see, just to give you a glimpse there of the sort of stuff which we were putting on at Bluecoat in the 90s, in the 80s, which I think sort of chimes a lot with what Jill was doing here in Rochdale. So I'm going to start. Get this right. Okay. Sorry. I know. It's just completely pitch black. I can't see a thing. Okay, so I'm going to start towards the end of the radical decade in May 1988, which incidentally was 20 years on from May 68, which was, for some of us in the room, that was a very radical sort of period with the student revolt in Paris and all of the things that happened that year. And in May 1988 was when the Tate of the North, which was later rebranded Tate Liverpool, opened. And that gallery's arrival provides a backdrop against which to consider the Bluecoat's programming, starting with events at the Art Centre that May and June, which I'm going to come to shortly. So it could be argued that the decision to locate the first Tate Gallery outside London in Liverpool's historic and derelict Albert Dock marked the start of a reorientation of the art map of Great Britain. An acknowledgement of both the existence of contemporary arts infrastructure in the north and an audience for it. It also heralded the beginning of high-profile arts-led urban regeneration, which I think is the beginning. It's quite an important story, actually, in this discussion we're going to have. A cultural repurposing of former industrial sites. In 1982, the then director of Tate, Alan Bowness, who was invited to open the Bluecoat's exhibition of the decorative work of Duncan Grant, announced in his speech that the choice of Liverpool was partly in recognition of the appetite for modern art in the city, citing the long-standing John Moore's exhibitions at the Walker and the Bluecoat itself, which had shown Picasso and Matisse as early as 1911. And as the UK's first art centre, had done much to introduce new art into the city. But the real carrot for the Tate, of course, was government funding, made available in the wake of the uprisings in Liverpool 8 in 1981, which were dubbed by the media as the Toxic Riots. And a Quango, Merseyside Development Corporation, championed by Cabinet member Michael Heseltine, who argued for reinvestment in Liverpool rather than Margaret Thatcher's preferred option of managed decline. But the existence of venues like the Bluecoat, the Open Eye Gallery, Photography Gallery, the Liverpool Academy, the Art School, and the Moores family's patronage all contributed to the decision. And the presence of the Tate would in turn help facilitate the arrival of new players in the form of Moviola and later the Liverpool Biennial. It was only years later that I recognised the unintended irony of the placing of one of Barbara Kruger's "We Don't Need Another Hero" poster works. Public Art Commissioner's Art Angel had asked the Bluecoat to coordinate sites for the American artist's nationwide billboard project on Merseyside, and one of which we secured outside a building site that the following year would become the Tate. You probably recognise the architecture there. Okay, so Tate opened with three main displays: Starlit Waters, which was a British sculpture from the previous 2 decades, a surrealism exhibition, and Mark Rothko's Seagram murals. A few days later, Bluecoat launched a noisy exhibition of animated sculptures by London-based Nigerian artist Sakari Douglas Camp, followed a week later by an anarchic multimedia performance, Death by Free Enterprise, by a local collective that became known as Visual Stress, and that's the poster on the right. Do you know who that is, who the head is? Carlos the Jackal. It was very provocative because he was like the most hated man in the media, so they thought, let's stick him on a poster. This exhibition and performance reflected the marked differences between the two institutions beyond the yawning gap between their respective size, profile and resources. A difference that was ideological and curatorial. Douglas Camp's rattling figures, conjured from memories of rituals from her Calabari heritage, contrasted with the cool sophistication of starlit waters. While visual stresses assault on the Bluecoat building and its colonial origins was intended to cleanse the building of, and I quote, its taint of slavery. A purposeful and frankly quite dangerous intervention that had a sense of place and history that Tate's elaborate but underwhelming opening celebration performance, the invention of tradition by Bruce MacLean, Gavin Bryars and David Ward, seemed to lack. In Death by Free Enterprise and many other Bluecoat performances and exhibitions in the 1980s, there was a direct engagement with Liverpool's imperial and colonial past. A strategy I suppose we'd now call decolonisation, but we didn't really know that term, well, we didn't use that term at the time. Often through public realm interventions into resonant physical sites, like Peter McRae's Avenue of Heroes, staged among Liverpool's exclusively male Victorian statues outside St George's Hall. The gallery frequently extended into the busy city centre streets with performances that addressed issues like housing, this is a Manchester-based group called Those Environmental Artists, and regeneration, or installations at highly public sites. That's John Plowman, site next to the Bluecoat. Artists made connections to the Bluecoat's own history as a charity school, founded in the early 18th century by merchants deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade. A strand of work which we've continued to develop. And in fact, if you come to Bluecoat now, we've got an exhibition that's come out of an education project with young people, 14 to 18-year-olds, looking into our archive, but also looking further back 300 years to the origins of the Bluecoat. It was founded by slave traders, essentially. It's a really powerful exhibition. And then Manchester sculptor Andrew Robarts cast these shackled feet and chained them to the Bluecoat railings, while South African artist Gavin Janches showed his powerful painting series about the Middle Passage called Carabra, and you might be familiar with these paintings. But we accompanied this particular exhibition with another exhibition from the Institute of Race Relations and photographs by the Liverpool 8 Black Media Group, which helped position Carabra in a contemporary and specifically local context. So that's the poster from that. This programming represents what I call a curatorial urgency that was pertinent to a particular place and a time. The Bluecoat itself, with its contradictory history of philanthropy and being a symbol of Liverpool's early colonial enterprise, situated in the economic realities of a city under the cosh of Thatcher's neoliberal policies, and in the wider context of a fracturing post-imperial, post-industrial Britain, a society nonetheless being reshaped and invigorated by multiculturalism despite widespread racism and the rise of the right, and hanging over everything, the threat of nuclear annihilation. We sort of forget that, don't we? The 80s, we were really shit scared of what was going to happen to... you remember it well. Great exhibition there by Ray Walker, who died some years earlier. He was a Liverpool-born artist who, you might know his work from the Cable Street mural in East London. That's his most best-known work. And a friend of mine suddenly died, Brian O'Toole, whose lovely cartoons. And this programme represents what I've just done that bit, haven't I? For the rest of the talk, I'm going to give a brief summary of the key strands pursued by the Bluecoat this decade, and the artists that we felt were making vital work in response to the environment of the time. And I hope to demonstrate that why their work of necessity was radical. Firstly, in the mid-1980s, we started working with artists and curators from diverse backgrounds, predominantly of a younger generation from migrant communities, who coalesced around the term black art. Black Skin Bluecoat brought together the work of Keith Piper, Sonia Boyce, Eddie Chambers, and Tom, who later became Tam Joseph. I've got a couple of images. These are all taken from slides, actually, so the quality is not great, but at least we've got slides of this period, which is brilliant. That's Eddie Chambers on the right, and then Tom's work and Sonia Boyce on the other side. The first three of these artists, we worked with, again, as both artists and curators over the next literally 30 years, including in Trophies of Empire, which looked at the legacies of empire in 3 port cities, Liverpool, Bristol and Hull. And the idea was originated by Keith, who returned to Bluecoat many times, most recently in 2016, with a new commission, Unearthing the Banker's Bones. And then we worked with Eddie Chambers as a curator on several group touring shows. I think I've gone too far there. No, I haven't. That should be going back, shouldn't it? If I go left. You'd think. Keep going, keep going, keep going. That's it. Stop. Thank you. So back to Eddie Chambers as curator on several touring group shows like Black Art Plotting the Course and the solo show by Leslie Sanderson, who'd first exhibited in New Contemporaries alongside Keith Piper back in 1986. So the Bluecoat, I think Derek sort of talked about this, was one of a network of venues in the North and the Midlands, many run by local authorities, such as Rochdale, to support the burgeoning black art movement. And while many artists were based in London, there was a surprising lack of institutional support in the capital for their work, noticeably in the larger, bigger galleries, in contrast to their clamour today, it seems, to reflect this work. Alongside the predominantly Afro-Caribbean artists of the black art movement, the Bluecoat developed a strand of solo and group shows of British Asian artists, who linked to a local Indian arts festival called Milap, and sometimes crossing over into performance, as with Keith Khan's exhibition, Alali, which I'm just going to come to. Naiza Malik is actually Naiza Khan now. She's doing some really interesting work based between London and Pakistan. So Keith Khan, it was a mixture of performance and a visual art exhibition. So the second strand of work was really work by women artists, which I want to just talk briefly about, and a more conscious programming that tied into feminist agendas. And I know we're going to talk about that a bit later today. And it was a process for Bluecoat, which had started with the 1979 exhibition, so sorry, we're a bit ahead of your time frame here, called Phoenix, where Monica Ross, Sue Richardson, Susie Varty and Kate Walker created this installation over 10 days working in the gallery, the continuation of a project that had started at Birmingham Arts Lab. Remember that? Derek remembers that one. The following year, the Bluecoat was one of several venues to host the ICA exhibition, the touring show, which sort of mentioned before, Women's Images of Men. I mean, I'm interested in, you said it was mainly organised by middle-class women. That we should probably dig into that a bit deeper, because I'm really intrigued by that.
It's what Juliet Stein.
Yeah. I think she's right, but I'm not saying all the artists in it were necessarily. I've got a couple of images of that. That's how the gallery used to look, with the carpets and everything, and strip lights. And look at the gallery the gallery visitors. They're not young, trendy folk, are they? And sadly, Marissa Rueda, whose work is on the floor, she died recently in Barcelona, so I think she was in her 80s, but she's a wonderful artist from Argentina. So there's a couple more images there. And from this exhibition, we worked with one of its curators, Jacqueline Morrow, and other artists in the show, in a show that I curated called Power Plays, and a solo show by another one of the curators, Pat Whiteread, who actually is Rachel Whiteread's mum. And she's doing amazing work in the 80s and 90s around the environment, very sort of prescient work. Further shows followed, including Pam Skelton, you see there, and Judith Rugg, a very powerful series of prints about American imperialism. It makes me laugh now. They were doing what Putin was doing in Latin America, not quite to the same extent, but they were very powerful prints. Okay. And also a touring show from Rose Garrard. came from the Icon. And I love this one from Jill Posner. She did these, she actually did the billboard. She graffitied the billboards and then photographed them. And you can get a book of them. Okay. And then the third strand I want to talk about, sorry, I just missed one there. Right. Right, that's a funny one. It was performance. We started to do quite a lot of women's performance in the 80s, which really developed much more in the 90s. But the third strand that I want to talk about, and it's central to the Radical Decades programme at Bluecoat, was artists actually from Liverpool, from the wider northwest and of course the north itself. And they appeared prominently, many of them in what was their first show. We heard before, that artists in their 20s were creating shows then, and how did they do it? They did it, and there was a lot of really great work coming out of art schools, and we captured a lot of that. Certainly if you were in Liverpool and you were an interesting artist just graduating, we'd show your work. The period saw regional collaborations such as this one with Corner House and the Open Eye, called Connections, between Liverpool and Manchester. And for this, the Bluecoat featured the work of John Hyatt, who now lives on Merseyside, and Jenny Wilson, Liverpool artist who looked at the two regional TV soaps, Brookside and Coronation Street. And there was also a growth in this period of artist-led studio spaces such as the Bridewell Arena and Liverpool Artists Workshops. The last of these, the most avowedly left-wing, with its programme of public talks by visitors including Terry Atkinson and Griselda Pollock, and exhibitions accompanied by educational activities, as the case for the one here at the Bluecoat, which you can see on the right. And whether these artists represented an oppositional northern aesthetic in the beleaguered post-industrial heartlands, as suggested by Gabriel G. in his survey, Art in the North of England, is open to conjecture. Yet there was an engagement with politics, activism and cultural theory in much of the work that emerged in Liverpool in the mid to late 80s, with artists like Pete Clark, Sue and Dave Campbell and David Mabb, that timed very much with other artists showing at the gallery who were exploring the representation of politics and the politics of representation in their work. This is a show with Tony Bevan, Jan Wanger, Jefford Horrigan. I think Glynis Johnson was mentioned earlier today as well. Early in the decade, the Bluecoat developed a very fruitful relationship with the ICA in London that resulted in a show of then quite little-known artists from New York, including Cindy Sherman, Keith Haring and Robert Longo. It's quite ironic when the Tate did Haring a few years ago. They said, "Oh, it's a great coup for Liverpool." I said, "Yeah, we showed him in '82." And two shows that reflected current developments in graphics. A show of post-punk record sleeves called Cover Versions, and another called Graphic Rap of alternative comics. This embrace of wide pop culture reflected both a blurring of fine art boundaries that characterised the 80s and charted, for instance, in magazines like ZG, and Bluecoat's own curatorial promiscuity, with exhibitions of fashion, crafts, furniture and cartoons, all part of the gallery mix. Another important strand of Bluecoat programming that started at the end of the decade was video art, as moving image agency Moviola piloted its Video Positive Festival, which developed into the leading showcase for international video art in the UK. And the organisation growing exponentially from its office home at the Bluecoat before becoming the Foundation for Art and Creative Technology, better known as FACT, and moving to new premises. That's Mike Stubbs, by the way. The caption's gone. I don't know why it's gone, but that work is by Mike Stubbs, who was director of FACT later on. The decade also witnessed our first forays into international collaborations with an exhibition exchange programme with Liverpool's twin city of Cologne, and opportunities for Liverpool artists to present their work at the BBK Gallery, and for our audiences to see the latest work from one of Europe's major centres for contemporary art. But curiously, the German work, while technically accomplished and formally assured, seemed to lack any critical or radical edge. Discuss. In contrast, the programme in 1989, this is sort of quite pertinent, I suppose now, Leningrad's underground cultural scene, it was called Perestroika and the Avant-Garde, and it featured a rough and ready exhibition at the Bluecoat of unframed canvases, you can see them on the right there, the work having been held up at customs, and that we stapled the paintings to the wall the night before the opening, so it really felt like a sort of a revolutionary exhibition. And the work of the group of young modernists, dissidents calling themselves the New Artists, or the Club of Friends of Vladimir Vladimirovich Mayakovsky, ironically playing with Soviet iconography and Russian folk art. This at least felt radical, compared to the German work I mentioned. However illusory the artist's opposition to a creaking communist bureaucracy was. And the exhibition was enhanced by a memorable performance at the city's ornate St George's Hall by the band music collective Pop Mechanica, performing their first gig in the UK, which ended in the audience being pelted from the stage with raw sausages, as Liverpool's finest, including members of Echo and the Bunnymen, jammed with their avant-garde Russian comrades. We don't seem to be able to do these things anymore. But I'd like to sort of finish really on a sort of reflection on what might be considered the intersectionality of this period, the solidarity, if you like, of artists working across different agendas, brought into sharp focus by Thatcherism and her government's ideological attacks on the North. Tate naturally was immune to this, but slowly came to a sort of accommodation with its sense of place on the banks of the Mersey, if not with its own institutional history, so intertwined through its founder's sugar empire and the narrative of colonial Britain. By 1990, the gallery, the Tate that is, felt confident to consult with colleagues from venues across the North to arrive at a list of artists who were brought together in New North. Some of the artists had already shown at Bluecoat and indeed at Rochdale, and it was many years, however, before these and other artists were recognised as part of the construction of a northern narrative around radical practice as proposed by Gabrielle G and others. So I just want to end with just a couple more images. Again, that breadth of practice, some of these were touring exhibitions. And what you notice, if you're a sort of graphic design historian, you can we couldn't afford colour print. Most of these posters you've seen so far are black and white with a bit of red, which gave them that sort of radical edge because they're the sort of colours of Paris 68 and revolutionary graphics. So I just want to sort of finish with that, but also a brochure from that period, which gives you an idea of the sort of programme that we had. That this is from 1986, and I think it reflects that multi-art form nature of our programme because we were an art centre. But that combination of visual art, music, dance, literature, film, and programme breadth and artistic cross-fertilisation that I think was another characteristic of the decade we're talking about. There was less of that, being in silos. I think the practices were very fluid, which made for a richer sort of landscape, I think. So I'll leave it at that, unless there's any questions.
There's actual questions in the Q&A
Okay.
at the end.
Okay.
Thank you.
There you go. Thank you.